Hello, in this tutorial I'm going to be talking about playing with blocks. Blocks are a really interesting part of Rhino if you haven't encountered them already. They can change and really speed up how you design, and also they can change how you design with other people. And so I'm pretty excited to show you how blocks work and what they are. So what is a block? A block is a reusable piece of geometry that can be instantiated multiple times. So you define a block once, and you can create many instances from it. And the instances are all linked together, so if you change one instance, you can change all the other instances. Transformations can be applied onto this geometry, so the blocks can be transformed, scaled, etc. So let me show you how to make a block. Let's, kind of inspired by this, let's make a page of a sort, and maybe let's call it like, I'm going to create a little bit of abstract art. I'm going to call it bean window. That's my piece. Great, lovely. So I have a bundle of geometry, and while I'm working in 2D here, you can also do this in 3D as well. Type in block. It will ask me to define a block base point. This is the kind of initial point around which it knows where to put the other geometry in the block. So I'm going to choose the lower left-hand side corner. I'm going to call this bean window. I'll call this bean page. And I have then defined a block. And now this bundle of geometry is no longer geometry per se, it's a block instance, and you can tell because when I click on it, it says one block instance added to selection. And I can copy it around, and these are all instances of a block as well. The fun thing about blocks, like I said, is that they're all linked to each other. So if I go in and click on one block and put in block edit, you'll see this window pops up, and this kind of window indicates that we're in kind of a different editing mode. We're editing this one block, not other blocks. You'll notice I can't click on other things. I can only click on the blocks, the geometry in my block. And so I could delete something, move something around in here, and you'll notice that the moment I click on OK, all these other blocks will match to this one because they're all linked together. So if I hit OK, you'll see that these blocks are all matched. And again, you can apply transformations onto this geometry. So I can scale this block, and scale 1D this block. And so we go in here again and type in block edit. I could copy this again. Again, the moment I click on OK, the blocks are all linked together, so they all change simultaneously. A few things to note. Let's say I've already drawn another gorgeous bead, and I want to add it to my block. One way to do that is by using the block edit command, or a shorthand is to double click on a block. And you can see add object, and so I can say add object. I want to add this geometry to the block, and not only have I added it, I can move it into the block more closely. So just to be clear, what just happened is I added a piece of geometry to the block. Now the geometry I'm moving is inside of the block, while this geometry is outside of the block. It has made a copy of this geometry and moved it into the block. This is why you saw double for a second, or it seemed like they were kind of moved geometry off of it. So if I hit OK, then again, all the other blocks update. Also do block edit remove object, so I can say, these objects are great, I just want them removed. They have been removed. If I hit OK, you'll see all the blocks change. And while the lines are here, the geometry has been removed, but just removed out of the block into the world. So you can also set the base point of the block, which is to say, oh, I want the block not to have the geometry calibrated in relationship to this point, but another point. I'll move the geometry as well. But in general practice, I find myself mostly just using block edit, editing the geometry block edit, editing the geometry, hitting OK. So this is a really interesting process, and you might already be thinking of different ways in which you can apply it. The other aspect to know about blocks is that you can explode a block. And exploding means that it goes, it kind of undoes the block, and now we're just dealing with individual pieces of geometry. And so, because now these three things are linked, these three blocks are linked, but this is no longer a block, and that's why I can move the geometry separately. If I change this piece of geometry, and the blocks update, but this no longer updates because this is no longer a block. And so this is really interesting because you can have many different blocks. Here's another block and a few other instances, and they all are updating. And you know, if I actually change one of these blocks, let's say bring this corner down here, just copy it over, rotate it around, hit OK. Then all the other blocks change as well. So this is really cool in that I can, or you can really update a piece of geometry that will be repeated multiple times. And not only that, you can also have nested blocks that are inside of other blocks. So I've created in here a table block, which is a block that has other blocks inside of it. And so now these tables are all linked together. And so if I take this table, do the same thing, I'll either type in block edit or double click on it. I'm now editing these blocks. And actually on this left, you can also see this diagram of this table. This block is called table 1. And there's two types of blocks in it, one called page 2 and another one called example page, etc., etc., etc. You'll see the icons look different, and I'll explain that in a moment. And in any case, I can edit this table. Maybe I'll kind of, make my table a little bit neater. And then the moment I click OK, all the other table blocks will update as well. So not only, and not only can I do that, I can also, again, update the individual block. And so all the blocks inside of the blocks will update as well. And this is really interesting because all of a sudden I can have really detailed drawings that hinge on a series of individual blocks, or even that are, and I can from those individual blocks I can create blocks that contain those blocks. Here I can have another block of blocks, and then I can create this kind of landscape of blocks and pages and tables. So one of the major advantages of using blocks is that blocks take up less file size. The Rhino file is smaller in size and also faster to render using blocks. And so if we try exploding these blocks and save them, we can see the file size change. So just note that this file is 869 kilobytes. Basically, select these, type in explode. They're no longer blocks, now they're just individual pieces of geometry. Or actually, there's still blocks in there. So type in explode one more time. Now if I save it, the file went up to 1 megabyte. I'm going to undo that. And so, this will especially be helpful when you're dealing with 3D objects. This can give us massive savings in terms of file size and performance. And of course, we can have a block of blocks. I'm going to select all of this, type in block, and I'll call this classroom 1, let's say. Now I can copy this over. And we have all of a sudden this sort of massive dystopian classroom. It's not that dystopian. This is the block unit. Inside of these blocks are another set of blocks. If I double click on this, you can see actually the hierarchy of blocks we've seen. There's a classroom one. Instead of a classroom, there's multiple tables. Each table has these blocks inside of it. So I can actually go in and edit this block again, and I can say I could delete, let's say, that table. The moment I hit OK, it will remove those tables from all of the blocks. Let's try this again. Let me try to delete this table. Let me delete all the other tables in the block. And I could, say, go into here and say, I'm going to clear some of the pages off. And I've cleared some of the pages off from this table and thus in all of the other tables as well. So what you're seeing is here's a block of a block with a block. There's the blocks go next to 3 levels deep. And of course, these individual pages, I can go edit this one page. Let's add a little bit of text. Having added that text to this, now all the pages have that text on it as well. So this is a pretty interesting process, and hopefully you can see how maybe one of your design processes might be able to take advantage of this. And from the design side, it's a little bit more interesting if we tessellate this pattern. So far there are 4 commands, and we've talked about 2 commands, block and block edit. There's also insert and block manager. And these 2 commands are especially useful when we're dealing with a slightly more advanced way of using blocks. So blocks can be defined from files. This, I think, is a really interesting way to use blocks. This means that you can have a series of shared files that hold block definitions. And in order for the linking to work properly, you need to have 1 block per file. What does that mean? I'll show you. So I'm going to explain linking blocks with a new example. If I go into a different Rhino window, I've just created a plan drawing of a block. I'm going to save this as block dirty mug, actually. I'm going to overwrite an existing file, but just imagine that I've defined a new file called block dirty mug.3dm. And notice that this file is not a block, it's just a series of geometry. So if I go back into my other Rhino file, I can use the command insert. So insert is a command that lets us insert blocks. And if I click on name, there's this drop down, and you can see there are all these other blocks. Some of these blocks are blocks that are not visible. But you can see that, for example, classroom 1 exists, which we defined earlier in this tutorial. If I click on OK, I can insert that series of that block into this file. But I can also use the folder open command or the file open command to insert a specific file, and I'm going to insert block 39 in here. Now this option window pops up. I'll explain a little bit more about this in a moment, but I highly recommend clicking linked and reference. And so when I do that, I can insert this 3D file. I can insert it as a group, or I can insert it as individual objects, but I can insert it most importantly as a block. So when I do that, I'm actually inserting what's in the other 3D file as a block. So I can have these multiple files. If I go into the other Rhino file, I could edit the block a little bit. Let's see, maybe this large spot disappears, and looks more like this, strange dirty looking mug. And if I go back into the 3DM file, you'll notice that it hasn't changed yet. If we type in block manager, now you'll see all these different blocks. One of the blocks is called block dirty mug, and it'll show us the link status. So some blocks are not linked in that the block definition exists inside of this file. For block dirty mug, because we inserted it from an external file, it is linked, and not only is it linked, the linked file is newer, and that's because we just updated it. It'll show us where the link is from, or where the linked file exists. And now if I click on this and hit on update, it'll say 1 block updated successfully, and you'll see all these mugs have updated corresponding to our V file. There's also another way to edit this box. I can actually type in block edit, and what will show is it'll say edit linked block. Another copy of Rhino will be opened to edit this block. So if I click on OK, it will actually pause on this instance of Rhino, and it will actually launch another version of Rhino, which can be a little slow. The advantage of editing a block this way is that you don't have to click on that update process. Once the new version of Rhino launches, let's say I'm going to add like a coaster. Here's a rectangular coaster that I'm going to fillet the corners of it. Oops, fillet the corners, 3-inch radius, and since coasters are never directly on the mug, trim my coaster. And let's say this is our now new dirty mug. If I save this file and I close this Rhino window, it'll go back to the original window and the blocks will update. And so this is really interesting because these blocks are actually referencing another file. So you could actually, this is one way in which you could collaborate, where you could arrange a series of blocks and other people could be editing the blocks that then update other files. And not only can you do this, you can have nested blocks. So I'm going to, let's say, open the save this file, open a new file. So let's try this again. I'm going to insert block dirty mug, and I'll link, and I'll use layer style reference. And again, I'll explain those in one moment. So I can add this block, and I'm going to add a bunch. I'm just going to use the command maelstrom, which normally distorts geometry, but in the case of blocks, it will kind of randomly size, and it might not affect the size, but it'll kind of arrange and rotate them around. So here's my pile of dirty mugs. And again, each one of this is a block. And so I can check what's going on, how many blocks I have, using the command block manager. In the block manager, there's one block, type of block defined. I can go into the properties of it, see the properties. Maybe this is a good point to explain how this works. The block definition type is, there are three types: embedded, embedded and linked, and linked. Embedded means that the block is embedded in the page. So the Rhino 3D file has internally its own version of the block, and so it's no longer using an external file. Embedded and linked is kind of halfway in between embedded and linked, where the Rhino file will try to use the external file, but also have a version that's embedded. I've actually found this to be a little bit buggy, so usually I use linked, which will always refer to the external file. The disadvantage of this is that you have to remember to move your files together. If you're familiar with InDesign, it's a little bit like how the IENDD file as well as the images have to be moved around. The plus is that it's much better at handling the linking of blocks together. And lastly, the layer style. There's two different layer styles. One is called active, one is called reference. The short version of this is that reference will use, well, perhaps the best way is to describe, but they both will show the layers used in the block inside of the kind of containing file in a different way. So let's try to edit this. I've double click the block. It's going to launch another instance of Rhino. And let's say in this instance, I'm going to add a few layers. I'm going to call this coaster. Coaster layer, and move this geometry onto it. I'll call this the mug layer. Perhaps we can call it ceramic. And let's say I'll call this coffee. So this block actually uses 3 different layers. And I'll save it, and I'll close this file. And now we're going back into this other file, which now contains these blocks that are now edited, have been edited. So if we go to the layers of this, you can see that there are all these different layers, and there's the block dirty mug layers, and you can see that they've kind of been imported like this as children of the block. Sorry, and I actually find this is quite neatly organized and helpful to understand. If you use the active layer style, what will happen is that now the containing file will have its own layers called coaster, ceramic, and coffee, and you can actually turn off the layers of all the block layers as well, which can be incredibly convenient as well. If I go back and change to the reference layer, these layers don't actually mean anything anymore because there's no geometry in these layers, so I'll delete these layers. But I can also control the individual layers inside of this block. And so the active versus reference layer choice is pretty much up to you. I find that it's really helpful to use reference because it will organize my layers underneath this block, and it won't clutter my file with all these layers that actually have no geometry on them. But if you're doing renderings, for example, and want to, say, just have a ceramic layer and just apply one material onto that layer, that's definitely what you would want to use. In any case, this is a file, and I'm going to save this file. So I will call this block dirty mug pile. And so now I have a Rhino file that has all these blocks inside of it. And I'm going to open my file again, which is called playing with blocks. So now I can insert the block dirty mug pile. I'm going to link it, use reference as a layer style. And here we go. And I've brought in this, which is, again, a block from an external file, which itself references other blocks from a file. So if I go into my folder directory, and you'll have to ignore the gray files, as if you've used Rhino, you know that these are the backup files. But this is the current file I'm using, and these two, the dirty mug and the dirty mug pile, are the 2 files I'm using. Dirty mug is referenced by dirty mug pile. Dirty mug pile is referenced by playing with blocks. So we have this really interesting system, and so I could actually go into dirty mug, say another user opens this up. Maybe this file directory is shared with Dropbox actually, or some other file sharing platform. And so if you're collaborating with someone, I could go and change dirty mug file, or excuse me, block dirty mug. Maybe in this new mug, the mug not only is dirty, it has just coffee in it. Cold coffee. A little bit of a stain. Stain outside of the coaster. The coaster completely failed at doing its job. And so I could edit this. Someone else could edit this. Your collaborator could edit this. And when you go back to this file, this hasn't changed, but you can go to Block Manager. You can see Block Dirty Mug is newer, and for Block Dirty Mug, the file is newer, and for Block Dirty Mug pile, its nested linked files are newer. So I could say update. That block edited successfully. I can update this one as well. And so as a result, all of my blocks have updated because someone else, quote unquote, edited a different Rhino file. So the advantage of linking blocks this way is that a Rhino model can be composed modularly and thus collaboratively. For example, each person can create a series of 3DM files to act as blocks. Those 3DM file blocks can also be composed of blocks, and these nested blocks can then be used in a design file by one person, while the individual blocks can be also changed by another person. And so this way of making blocks is very modular and thus collaborative, and hopefully you can see how you can kind of lead to these kind of compositions of detail. You can design a file of files. You can change one block, change all the other blocks. And hopefully when you get to collaborating with other people and perhaps inventing this kind of drawing plan or working with 3D geometry or even creating a notation, you can try using out blocks as a way to make your design process collaborative, detail-oriented, full of details, and also efficient, because this file is relatively small. It's not containing all this geometry. It's containing references to geometry. If you'd actually like to try this out yourself, here are 3 challenges. Challenge 1 is to create a desk, much like the example you saw, using 4 blocks, for example, a paper, pen, cup, and book. Create 3 desks using blocks that contain those initial blocks, and then create 2 different classroom environments that are composed out of those desks. Challenge 2 is to create a forest by composing out of trees that are composed by boughs, boughs that are composed by branches, and branches that are composed out of leaves. And challenge 3 is to invent a new way to collaborate using a series of linked blocks. The more intricate, the better. I hope you can see how this kind of block structure lends itself to a kind of modular, nested system of interrelating drawings on top of each other. And now that we can work with linked blocks, linking external 3DM files into another random file, it's really worthwhile thinking how you can experiment with that, how you can collaborate with another person, how you could maybe collaborate entirely by only editing the blocks and not editing the file that contains the blocks, or vice versa. How you could experiment with kind of a Mad Libs-esque visual approach where you have different blocks that can be swapped out for one another and drastically change the meaning of the drawing. I hope you have a fun time and an interesting time thinking about how this can change the way you draw and agree with someone else. Thanks for watching, and that's all, folks.